Picture a house so unremarkable that nobody ever gave it a second glance. For 3 years, an elderly man lived there alone, quiet, keeping to himself, barely exchanging a word with the people around him. To his neighbors, he was just a solitary old man living out his days in silence. Nobody suspected a thing, and nobody, not a single person, could have imagined that hidden beneath the very floorboards he walked across every single day was a secret that history would shock an entire city. Our story starts in Busan, South Korea's largest port city and one of its most iconic. The city is split into 2 distinct halves by a sea bridge, each side with its own character, its own rhythm, its own way of life. Cross the southern bridge, and the high-rises and city noise start to fall away. The urban sprawl gives way to something quieter, something different. That place is Yeongdo. Yeongdo sits at the southern edge of Busan, with the city at its back to the east and the open strait to the south, close enough that, on a clear day, you can almost feel the presence of Japan's Tsushima Island across the water. This neighborhood used to mean something. It was once a proud, thriving hub of shipbuilding, the kind of place where people had work, had purpose, had a future. But over the decades, the economy shifted, industries dried up, and the young people left. They packed up and headed into Busan proper, chasing jobs and opportunity. What they left behind was a neighborhood that aged quietly in their absence. Today, the streets of Yeongdo move slow. Life there carries a certain weight to it, a stillness that feels less like peace and more like something slowly fading. It was in one of Yeongdo's modest homes that an elderly couple was trying to get by. The husband, Lee Kyung-soo, was 67 years old. His wife, Jung E-suk, was 4 years younger. Despite being well past the age when most people are thinking about retirement, Mr. Lee had no such luxury. Every day, he had to leave home and work somewhere else entirely, only making it back to Yeongdo on weekends. To make up for not being there, he made a point of staying connected. Every day or two, without fail, he'd pick up the phone and call his wife, just to hear her voice, just to make sure she was okay. To everyone who knew them, they were the kind of couple that had stood the test of time. Decades together and still going strong. But what Mr. Lee didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that while he was out there grinding away to keep them afloat, something was quietly changing back him. Another man had started appearing in his wife's life with increasing regularity. Ms. Jung was carrying on a secret affair right under her husband's roof. And it was inside that hidden relationship, tangled, complicated, and full of risk, that something truly deadly had begun to take shape. June 8, 2005, a Wednesday. Yeongdo woke up the same way it always did, slowly, quietly, wrapped in that thin coastal mist that rolls in off of the water and makes everything look a little softer than it really is. It felt like any other morning in this sleepy district, but dozens of kilometers away, something was already off. Mr. Lee was at work, grabbing a rare moment to breathe, when he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his phone. It had been 2 days since he'd left home, 2 days of the same routine they'd kept up for years. By this hour, his wife should have been up for a while already. She'd typically tidy the house in the morning, then wait for his call. So Mr. Lee dialed home, the same way he always did. The phone rang, and nobody picked up. In all the years they'd spent living apart like this, that had never happened before, not once. Mr. Lee stood there, holding the phone, and that familiar comfort he usually felt after hearing her voice was suddenly replaced by something cold and uneasy. He told himself she was probably fine. Maybe she'd stepped out. Maybe she just missed the call. But he couldn't shake the feeling. He was too far away to go check himself, and he still had work to get through. So he did the next best thing. He thought of an old friend who lived close to the house. This friend had been in Mr. Lee's life for many years, a carpenter by trade, reliable and warm-hearted, the kind of guy who never made you feel like you abide. He'd looked after Mr. Lee's place more than once over the years. Mr. Lee called him up, quickly explained what was going on, and asked if he'd mind swinging to grocery store by the house to check on things. The carpenter called back a little while. Later, the front door was locked up tight, he said. He'd been standing outside calling out, knocking hard, but nothing. No sounds from inside, no response at all. He figured Miss Jung had probably just gone out to run some errands and would be back soon. It was a reasonable explanation, but for Mr. Lee, hearing that report didn't ease his nerves at all. If anything, it made them worse. By around 10 in the morning, Mr. Lee couldn't just sit with it anymore. He came up with another plan. He reached out to Mr. Wang, who ran a Chinese and restaurant on the ground floor of the same building where Mr. Lee lived. The setup of the place was a little unusual. Mr. Lee's home was up on the second floor, directly above the restaurant. And tucked behind the kitchen was a private internal staircase that led straight up to his unit. Mr. Lee asked Mr. Wang if he'd be willing to head up and take a look. Mr. Wang didn't hesitate. He stepped away from what he was doing, walked back through the kitchen, and made his way upstairs. The moment he walked in, something felt wrong. The living room was a mess, things scattered around, out of place. And there was a smell, faint, but enough to make him stop. Mr. Wang moved carefully toward the master bedroom. He pushed the door open, and there, lying motionless underneath the blanket, was Miss Jung. She was gone. Mr. Wang didn't waste a second. He ran back downstairs, called Mr. Lee to tell him what he'd found, and immediately called the police. When that call came through, Mr. Lee felt the ground disappear from under him. He dropped everything, didn't think twice about work, and made his way back to Yeongdo as fast as he could. By the time he arrived, the police had already taped off the scene. When he confirmed that the woman inside was his wife, his partner of a lifetime, the man completely fell apart. Everything he had been working toward, every quiet hope for their later years together, had vanished in the span of a single morning. Miss Jung Yi-suk was 63 years old. And if you look back at her life, it was one defined almost entirely by hardship. She and Mr. Lee had known each other since they were young, fell in love, got married, and built a life together from the ground up. But it was never an easy life. The struggles came early and never really let up. By the time most people their age were slowing down, thinking about grandchildren and quiet afternoons, this couple was still grinding, still trying to make ends meet. To save whatever money they could, Mr. Lee had taken work far from home, leaving Miss Jung behind in Yeongdo. And she wasn't sitting still either. She had picked up a night shift job locally. Tough, demanding work that kept her on her feet for hours every evening. She typically didn't get home until around 1 in the morning. When investigators got to work at the scene, what they found painted a disturbing picture. The main circuit breaker in the electrical box had been deliberately switched off. Whoever did this had cut the power to the entire house, leaving it pitch dark. And yet, every door and every window was intact. No signs of forced entry anywhere. Ms. Jung had been stabbed more than 20 times. Her arms bore multiple defensive wounds, signs that she had fought back, that she hadn't gone without a struggle. The medical examiner determined she had died from blood loss and placed the time of death somewhere between 1:30 and 2 o'clock in the morning. When forensic technicians scraped beneath her fingernails, they found something significant: skin tissue and a small amount of blood that didn't belong to her. All of it was packaged up and sent to the lab. Piecing together the details, investigators began to reconstruct what had likely happened. Miss Jung was still dressed in her going-out clothes when she was found, suggesting she had come home from her shift and hadn't even had a chance to change. The working theory was that whoever did this had followed her home from work, then forced their way in the moment she opened the door, before she could close it behind her. It was quick. It was violent. And it was clearly not random. That last point became even clearer when investigators dug into something else. Nothing in the house had been taken place. No cash, no valuables, nothing. If this had been a robbery that escalated, the killer would have had every reason to grab something on the way out. But they hadn't. They'd come specifically for her. And then there was the fire. Just 10 days before the murder, Miss Jong's house had caught fire under suspicious circumstances. She had woken up choking on smoke, managed to call for help, and gotten out in time. Investigators had noted it then, but now, looking at these two events side by side, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Someone had tried to kill this woman once before, and when that failed, they came back and finished it. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random attack. This was calculated. This was personal. And whoever was behind it had been planning it for a while. So if this was premeditated, if someone had been targeting Miss Jong deliberately, then that someone had to fit a very specific profile. They needed to know her schedule. They needed to know when she got off that late-night shift and what time she'd be walking through that door. And they needed to be able to get into that house in the middle of the night without anyone noticing. That kind of access, that kind of knowledge, it doesn't come from a stranger. It comes from someone close. And that line of thinking pointed investigators straight to the most obvious person first, her husband, Mr. Lee. On paper, the suspicion made sense. The two of them had been living largely separate lives for years, together on weekends, apart during the week. That kind of arrangement can hide a lot of tension. What if the marriage had been falling apart in ways nobody else could see? The theory wasn't hard to construct. Mr. Lee could have quietly slipped back into Yeongdo on the night of the murder, used his key to get in, done what he came to do, and then driven back to his workplace before sunrise. The next morning, he plays the worried husband, calls the house, gets no answer, asks a friend to check in. It would have been a clean alibi if it held up. But it didn't. Investigators found no evidence of any serious conflict between Mr. Lee and his wife. More importantly, surveillance footage from the area around his out-of-town residence confirmed he was there that night. There was simply no window of time in which he could have made the trip to Yeongdo and back. Mr. Lee was cleared completely. Attention then shifted to the man who had actually walked into that apartment and found the body, Mr. Wang, the restaurant owner downstairs. The detail that made him interesting to investigators was the way he had accessed the scene. He hadn't come through the front door like anyone else would. He'd gone up through that private internal staircase tucked behind his restaurant kitchen, a route that completely bypassed the street and any cameras outside. If someone wanted to enter Miss Jones' home without being seen, that passage was practically purpose-built for it. Mr. Wang had known about it all along. He had easy access anytime he wanted. But again, the evidence didn't follow the suspicion. There was no sign of any bad blood between Mr. Wang and Miss Jong. And when investigators checked his alibi for the night of the murder, it held up solidly. He wasn't at the restaurant. He wasn't anywhere near the scene. He was out. With both early suspects cleared, forensic investigators went back to the physical evidence and started looking harder. Combing through the clutter on the floor of the apartment, they found a footprint. They measured it, 24 centimeters long, with a distinctive star-shaped pattern on the sole. For context, the average adult male foot runs well over 26 centimeters. This print was noticeably smaller than that particular. It most likely belonged to a woman, or possibly a very short man. A closer analysis confirmed it had been made by a pair of women's hiking sandals. Neither Mr. Lee nor Mr. Wang wore anything close to that size. The drainage system gave them something else to work with. Inside the pipes, technicians pulled out several torn fragments of latex gloves. Testing came back positive for blood. The picture that emerged was of someone methodical, someone who had worn gloves during the attack, then cut them into pieces afterward and flushed them down the toilet, trying to scrub away any trace of what they'd done. This wasn't someone who panicked. This was someone who had thought it through. While the lab results were still pending, life in Yeongdo paused for a moment to say goodbye. Ms. Jung's funeral was held, and Mr. Lee was barely holding together. The grief had hollowed him out completely. At his age, with everything hitting him all at once, he came close to collapsing right there at the service. The only reason he made it through was because of the man standing beside him the entire time. His old friend, the carpenter, who had been there since that first panicked phone call and hadn't left his side since. For over 30 years, these two men had been close, and in Mr. Lee's darkest moment, that friend showed up in every way that seemed to matter. Throughout the funeral, the carpenter was everywhere, helping coordinate arrangements, staying close to Mr. Lee, making sure he didn't fall apart completely. But it was one moment in particular that caught people off guard. Mr. Lee was in such bad shape that he couldn't even carry his own wife's portrait. The framed photograph that leads the procession, the image that represents the person being mourned. So the carpenter stepped in. He took the portrait into his own hands, held it against his chest, and walked with it. And as he walked, he wept. Not quietly, not with restrained dignity. He sobbed openly, bitterly, in front of everyone. People lining the streets who didn't know the situation assumed he was the grieving husband. He looked that devastated. Mr. Lee, lost in his own pain and barely aware of what was happening around him, didn't register anything strange about it. But the investigators who were present registered it immediately. They watched this man hold another man's wife's portrait and break down like he had lost the love of his life. And something about it didn't sit right. There's a line between being a loyal, caring friend and what they were witnessing, and this had crossed it. No matter how long two families had known each other, that level of raw grief over someone else's wife was not normal. It was a tell. And just like that, the focus of the investigation quietly shifted. The more detectives looked into it, the more a story emerged that Mr. Lee had never been allowed to know. The carpenter's name was Kwon Chel-soo. He was 66 years old, a Yeongdo local his entire life, earning his living with his hands. To look at him, he was just a slightly balding older man, unassuming, the kind of guy you'd trust without thinking twice. He and Mr. Lee went all the way back to their youth, more than 3 decades of friendship. And because Mr. Kwon was genuinely skilled at his trade, Mr. Lee had always called him first whenever something needed fixing or building around the house. Over time, through all those visits, Mr. Kwon and Ms. Jong had naturally gotten to know each other too. What Mr. Lee didn't know was that gotten to know each other was a massive understatement. At some point, nobody could say exactly when, the relationship between Mr. Kwon and Ms. Jong had crossed a line it had no business crossing. The two of them had been carrying on a secret affair for years, and it wasn't even particularly hidden on his end. Whenever Mr. Lee was away for work, Mr. Kwon would come and go from that house freely, spending time with Ms. Jong as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For investigators, this changed everything. If Mr. Kwon had been that close to Ms. Jong for that long, he knew her schedule inside and out. And there was a very good chance he had a key to that front door. But here's where things got complicated. Because even with all of that, the affair, the access, the suspicious behavior at the funeral, there was still that footprint. A women's hiking sandal, just under 9.5 inches long, pressed into the floor of the crime scene. That print had pointed investigators toward a woman or a very short man, and Mr. Kwon was neither. So how did it get there? Who did it belong to? That question sent investigators down a new path. What if Mr. Kwon wasn't the one who actually walked into that apartment that night? What if someone else had found out about the affair? Someone with just as much reason to be furious and had decided to handle it herself? That someone would have been Mr. Kwon's wife. Her family name was Sun, and investigators were ready to bring her in and start asking questions. That's when they hit a wall they weren't expecting. Miss Sun wasn't around. According to Mr. Kwon, she had walked out on him roughly 3 years earlier after some trouble at home, and nobody had seen or heard from her since. Just like that, she had dropped off the map entirely. That revelation didn't redirect suspicion away from Mr. Kwon. It pulled it right back to him, harder than before. Because now a new theory was taking shape in the back of investigators' minds, and it was a chilling one. What if Mr. Kwon had put on a pair of women's shoes the night of the murder, deliberately, carefully, specifically to throw the investigation off, to make it look like the killer was a woman? It was calculated, it was cold, and it was exactly the kind of move someone might make if they'd already proven they could keep a secret. The theory was entirely plausible. Mr. Kwan was brought in for questioning. Sitting across from detectives, he didn't seem rattled. He was calm, almost unnervingly so. He didn't bother denying the affair. That was already out in the open, and he knew it. But he was firm about one thing. On the night Miss Jong was killed, he had been home in bed the entire time. He said he hadn't left the house, hadn't gone anywhere, and only found out something was wrong the next morning when Mr. Lee called him in a panic. To strengthen his case, he volunteered an extra detail that after leaving Mr. Lee's building on the morning the body was discovered, he had gone straight to a government office to take care of some personal paperwork. He offered it up like it proved something. It didn't, because here was the problem with his alibi. There was nobody to back it up. The murder happened in the early morning hours, the kind of hour when the world is dark and still and no one is watching. Mr. Kwan's kids were all grown, married, and living in their own homes, and his wife, as he himself had told police, was gone. That left him completely alone in that house. His claim that he'd been asleep in bed all night was exactly that, just a claim. There wasn't a single person on Earth who could confirm it. And then investigators uncovered something that made the financial picture come into very sharp focus. Buried beneath the affair, beneath the suspicion, beneath the missing wife, there was money, a lot of it. 2 years before Miss Jong was murdered, she had borrowed 100 million Korean won from Mr. Kwan. To put that in perspective, that was enough money to buy a decent house at the time. And in the 2 years that followed, she had paid back exactly nothing, not a single one. Suddenly, Mr. Kwan wasn't just a man with access and opportunity. He was a man with a very clear, very concrete reason to want Miss Jong gone. Police took a DNA swab and sent it off to be compared against the biological material recovered from beneath her fingernails. While they waited on those DNA results, another question had taken root in the minds of investigators and refused to let go. Miss Sun, Mr. Kwan's wife, missing for nearly 3 years. Had she actually left, or had she never left at all? Mr. Kwan's home was a residential house in Yeongdo, with his carpentry workshop sitting right next door. That's where he spent most of his days, taking whatever jobs came his way through word of mouth, neighbors, friends, people in the community who needed something built or fixed. It wasn't steady work. There was no guaranteed paycheck at the end of the week. If the referrals dried up, so did the income. So Mr. Kwan had always been careful with money, always made sure to put something away. He had built up savings over the years through sheer discipline and consistency. He and Miss Sun had 3 children together, but by the time she disappeared, all 3 had long since grown up, moved out, and started their own families. That left just the 2 of them rattling around in that house, which meant that when Miss Sun vanished, the only account of what had happened, the only version of events anyone had to go on, was the one Mr. Kwan was telling. There was no one else in that house to contradict him, to add a detail, to say, "That's not how I remember it." His word was the only word there was. And the more investigators looked at that word, the less comfortable they were with it. For starters, Mr. Kwan had waited, hadn't rushed to file a missing persons report, hadn't launched any kind of personal search effort, hadn't shown the kind of urgency you'd expect from a husband whose wife had suddenly disappeared. But what really stopped investigators cold was what Miss Sun had left behind. Her cell phone was still at the house. Her wallet was there. She hadn't taken any cash, hadn't taken any valuables, nothing. If a person walks out on their life, even in anger, even in a hurry, they typically grab something. A phone, some money, anything. Miss Sun had apparently walked out the door with nothing but the clothes on her back and never surfaced again anywhere. It didn't add up. That gnawing feeling pushed detectives to reach out to Mr. Kwan's children to see if they could shed any light on where their mother might have gone. What they got back was not what they expected. These were people whose mother had been missing for 3 years, and not one of them seemed particularly troubled by it. No worry, no urgency, no grief, just a kind of flat indifference that was hard to read at first. As investigators dug deeper into why, the picture became a little clearer. Miss Sun, it turned out, had struggled with a serious gambling addiction for years, and it had gotten bad. She had racked up debts, and when things got overwhelming, she had a pattern of disappearing for stretches of time. Sometimes a few days, sometimes weeks. She'd done it before, more than once. On top of that, as the kids had gotten older and moved on with their own lives, the ties to their parents had loosened considerably. They weren't close, they didn't check in much. So when their mother went missing this time, it didn't feel dramatically different from all the other times she'd vanished to dodge her creditors. Some of them, if they were being honest, even admitted that things felt a little lighter without the chaos she brought with her. Nobody had pushed for answers. Nobody had really looked. But when investigators started pulling apart Mr. Kwan's finances, what they found made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Shortly after his wife disappeared, Mr. Kwan had started making the rounds at insurance companies, not just one, multiple companies. He'd go in, sit down, and ask detailed, specific questions about different types of coverage, what kinds of policies were available, what the payout structures looked like, how the claims process worked. And then, one by one, he started signing on the dotted line. By the time it was all said and done, he had taken out policies on his missing wife through 4 separate insurance companies, accident coverage, cancer coverage, and more. All of it with himself listed as the beneficiary. Here's how the math worked, and Mr. Kwan had clearly already done it himself. Under Korean law at the time, if a person is reported missing for 5.5 years without any trace, a court can issue an official declaration of death. The moment that declaration came through, Mr. Kwan would have walked into those 4 insurance offices, paperwork in hand, and collected a total payout of around 40 million won. Run the numbers on what he was spending to get there. Roughly 200,000 won a month in premiums over 66 months comes out to about 13.2 million won total. Spend 13 million, collect 40 million. In his mind, it was an investment. The return just required his wife to stay missing permanently. His family car had already been impounded over unpaid debts, and still he kept those premiums current every single month without fail. He was methodically, patiently betting on a dead woman's life insurance to dig himself out of a financial hole, and that woman was buried under his floor. Because here's what investigators were now beginning to understand about the 3 years that had passed since Ms. Sun disappeared. Mr. Kwan had not been living peacefully. How could he? He had done something unspeakable, and the evidence was literally beneath his feet every time he walked across his own home. He couldn't bring himself to sleep in that bedroom, not with her there, under the floor. So at some point he went out and bought a bed, brought it into the master bedroom, and started sleeping on top of it every night, telling himself it helped. It didn't, not really. 3 months of that, and he was still a wreck inside. So he came up with another plan. Using the cover of doing some home repairs, a perfectly natural thing for a carpenter to be doing, he dug up the floor himself. He knew what he was doing. He'd worked with his hands his whole life, and the physical part wasn't the challenge. His original plan was to move everything under the living room floor, somewhere less personal than the bedroom. But when he got into it, the space wasn't as big as he'd counted on. So he made a decision that speaks to just how far gone he already was. He dismembered his wife's body and distributed the remains across 3 separate areas, beneath the bedroom floor, beneath the living room floor, and beneath the entryway. Then he mixed cement, filled everything back in, smoothed it all flat, and walked away. To anyone who stepped inside that house, there was nothing to see, just floors. When police finally came through the door, they found exactly that. Smooth, hardened concrete underneath their feet. And on the wall above it, a family photograph. Everyone in it smiling. The officers pulled up the floors based on what Mr. Kwan described during questioning, and piece by piece, the truth that he had spent 3 years burying came back to the surface. As interrogation continued, Mr. Kwan let slip another detail, one that filled in the last missing piece of why Ms. Jung had to die. Because it wasn't just about the money she owed him, As massive as that debt was, there was something else eating at him, something that had kept him up at night long before he ever made his move. At some point during one of their arguments over the unpaid loan, things had gotten heated. Words were flying. And in the middle of it all, Ms. Jong had said something, almost certainly without thinking, probably just reaching for whatever would sting the most in that moment. She threw it in his face that he had a history of abusing his wife, and then she twisted the knife a little further, snapping at him. "What, are you going to treat me the same way you treated her?" She had no idea what she was actually saying. To her, it was just a cutting remark in the heat of an argument. But to Mr. Kwan, standing there with a body under his floorboards, those words landed like a thunderclap. His mind immediately went to the worst place. Did she know something? Had she figured it out? Had he slipped up somewhere along the way and given her a reason to suspect what was really beneath that floor? He couldn't be sure. And that uncertainty was unbearable. In that moment, whatever complicated feelings he had for Ms. Jong, the years of closeness, the affair, whatever had existed between them, all of it evaporated. She wasn't his partner in a secret anymore. She was a liability, a living, breathing threat who could bring everything crashing down around him the moment she decided to open her mouth to the wrong person. So he made the decision to make sure she never got that chance. What's worth pausing on, what investigators and observers found genuinely disturbing, was the complete absence of remorse. Not just after the arrest, but throughout. When police came for him, Mr. Kwan's attention drifted to his garden. He mentioned, almost casually, that he had planted the flowers out there himself. He seemed genuinely concerned about who would take care of them once he was gone. 2 women were dead, one buried in pieces beneath his own home, another stabbed more than 20 times in her bed, and the thing weighing on this man's mind was his garden. The flowers, apparently, mattered more. When the full truth came out, Mr. Lee was devastated in a way that went beyond ordinary grief. He had lost his wife, but he had also lost his best friend of 30 years, and then discovered that those 2 people had been deceiving him together for years. And that the man he had leaned on at his wife's funeral, the man who had held her portrait and wept in front of everyone, was the one who had killed her. A marriage and a lifelong friendship, both of them lies. The people of Yeongdo couldn't wrap their heads around it either, that this quiet, dependable old carpenter had spent 3 years sleeping above his wife's remains, then murdered his mistress to protect his secret, then stood at her funeral and performed grief in front of a crowd. It was the kind of thing that didn't seem possible until it was proven beyond any doubt. The case went to trial at the Busan District Court a few months later. Kwon Chel-soo faced charges of murder and related offenses. The prosecution laid out the evidence methodically, arguing that he had killed in cold blood, first to cover up what he had done to his wife, then to eliminate a woman he feared might expose him. They pointed to his total lack of genuine remorse and asked the court for the death penalty. The defense pushed back, painting a picture of a man who had never intended to kill his wife, that it had started as an attempt to intervene in her gambling, that things had spiraled out of control in the heat of the moment. As for Ms. Jong, they leaned on the financial pressure he'd been under, the crushing weight of a debt that was never going to be repaid. They asked for leniency. Mr. Kwan himself sat through the proceedings looking largely indifferent, as if the whole thing were happening to someone else entirely. The court came back with its verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence, 15 years in prison. The public reaction was immediate and sharp. 15 years for 2 murders, years of concealment, and not a shred of genuine remorse. It felt like an insult. Mr. Lee heard the news and went quiet for a long time. He had nothing to say. The lead investigator on the case was later invited onto a true crime television program, where he sat across from the host and said plainly what many people already felt. That 15 years was nowhere near enough, because what Kwon Chel-soo had done wasn't a crime of passion, wasn't a moment of weakness. Wasn't a man pushed too far by circumstances beyond his control. It was a pattern. It was planning. it was the kind of coldness that doesn't have a good explanation. And in the end, the very crimes he committed to keep his secrets buried were the ones that dragged everything into the light. The law had spoken, but for the people left behind, especially one grieving old man in Yeongdo-Mado, no sentence was ever going to be enough. That's all for today. We'll see you in the next one.